What if someone figured out exactly why empires collapse 700 years ago and nobody listened? Haha, spoiler, he also figured out your country's current budget problem. Let's talk. Long before anyone drew a chart, built a model, or wrote an economics textbook, one man noticed something that most systems still refuse to admit out loud. Wealth doesn't rise in a straight line. Power doesn't pile up forever, and prosperity, left on its own, quietly carries the seeds of its own destruction inside it. This wasn't some theory cooked up in a quiet university office. It was a pattern, observed in the real world, written down by someone who had actually watched empires rise, hit their peak, and rot from the inside out. And as always, nothing is ever as simple as it looks. It's the 14th century. Europe is drowning in plagues, wars, and feudal chaos. And while all of that is going on, a North African thinker sits down and quietly writes what might be the most accurate description of economic cycles ever produced. His name? Ibn Khaldun. Centuries before Adam Smith, centuries before modern macroeconomics, this man explained in clear, logical terms why economies grow, why states get fat and comfortable, and why they eventually collapse under their own weight. Ibn Khaldun was born in 1332 in what is now Tunisia, and the world he was born into was anything but stable. Dynasties rose and fell fast, cities boomed and emptied just as quickly. The plague tore through populations with brutal efficiency. Power shifted constantly between rulers, tribes, and factions. This wasn't the calm environment for abstract theorizing. It was chaos, and that chaos became his laboratory. He wasn't some academic locked away from reality. He served at courts, he advised rulers, he watched up close how governments mismanaged wealth, overtaxed their people, lost legitimacy, and then acted completely shocked when everything fell apart. Pecky, what did he notice over time? The same story, over and over again. Different names, different religions, different locations, but the same arc every single time. Discipline turned into comfort. Comfort turned into decadence. Decadence turned into decline. What makes Ibn Khaldun so relevant even today is this. He understood that economic systems are not machines. They are social organisms. They depend on trust, shared incentives, and a collective belief in the system. When those things weaken, no amount of gold, authority, or GDP data can save the structure. At the center of his entire framework was a concept he called asabiya, loosely translated, social cohesion, the glue that holds groups together. But in economic terms, it's much more than cultural unity. It's trust, it's shared incentives, it's the willingness of people to cooperate, sacrifice, and invest in something bigger than just themselves. Think of it like a startup team in its early days. Everyone's working insane hours. Everyone believes in the mission. Nobody's asking, what's in it for me? That energy, that's asabiya, and it's wildly productive. Ibn Khaldun observed that societies with strong cohesion were productive, resilient, and capable of building real wealth even with limited resources. When people trust each other, they work harder, they defend their institutions, they enforce the norms that support long-term stability. Wealth follows naturally, not because they started out richer, but because their structure allowed productivity to flourish. So what happens next? Success happens, and success changes behavior. As wealth accumulates, elites grow distant from the productive base that created it in the first place. Rulers become insulated, bureaucracies expand, military and administrative positions become inherited rather than earned. The discipline that built the whole system, it softens. Comfort replaces necessity. Cohesion weakens. And here's the key. Ibn Khaldun wasn't scolding anyone for getting lazy. He wasn't moralizing. He was describing incentives. Think about it like this. If you've already got a comfortable salary, a company car, and the corner office, are you really going to hustle the same way you did when you were starting from zero? Probably not. That's not a character flaw. That's just how incentives work. When survival is no longer urgent, behavior changes. Risk tolerance drops. Innovation slows. Extraction becomes easier than creation. The system begins to live off its past success rather than its present productivity. Nowhere is this clearer than his analysis of taxation. Early in a state's life, taxes are low. People work, trade, and invest willingly because the rewards clearly outweigh the burden. Economic activity expands. Revenue grows. Everyone's happy. As the state matures, rulers increase taxes to support growing courts, armies, and administrative layers. At first, revenue still rises, but eventually, higher taxes start discouraging production. People work less, trade shrinks, the tax base erodes. And what's the predictable response? Raise taxes again. Each increase accelerates the decline. The state isn't starving because it taxes too little, it's starving because it's taxing too much of a shrinking economy. In modern terms, Ibn Khaldun describes diminishing returns, centuries before the phrase even existed, and what makes his insight so powerful is its neutrality. He didn't argue that low taxes are virtuous or high taxes are evil. He argued something simpler and more universal. Incentives matter. When people believe that effort will be punished rather than rewarded, they disengage. When capital is extracted faster than it can regenerate, the system weakens. States don't collapse because they lack authority. They collapse because they exhaust the very source of their own strength. He extended this logic to government spending and corruption. As states age, rulers grow accustomed to luxury. Court life expands. Public funds get redirected to preserve status rather than productivity. Bureaucracies multiply. Positions get sold or inherited. Corruption doesn't begin as criminal intent, it begins as normalization. Everyone adjusts to the new standard. The system doesn't feel broken, it feels entitled. And that entitlement has consequences. Spending rises faster than output. To compensate, taxation increases. To enforce compliance, coercion expands. Trust erodes. As cohesion weakens, enforcement becomes more expensive and less effective. The state spends more to get less, trapped in a cycle of its own making. Sound familiar? Ha! Now, replace dynasties with institutions. Replace couriers with bureaucracies. Replace caravans with supply chains. The logic remains perfectly intact. Ibn Khaldun wasn't describing medieval peculiarities, he was describing universal behavior under power and prosperity. And perhaps his most important contribution is this one idea. Markets reflect people before they reflect numbers. Prices move because confidence moves. Productivity rises because incentives align. Decline begins not with collapse, but with subtle shifts in behavior. Less trust, more extraction, weaker cohesion. He didn't believe cycles could be prevented. He believed they could be understood. Awareness didn't stop decline, but it removed the illusion. It replaced surprise with clarity. And clarity, in his view, was the closest thing to control that humans ever get. If Ibn Khaldun were alive today, he wouldn't be impressed by our technology. He wouldn't be dazzled by the speed of markets, the complexity of financial instruments, or the sophistication of economic language. He'd look past the screens and the spreadsheets, and he'd focus on what he always focused on: incentives, cohesion, and power. And what he would see would feel painfully familiar. Modern economies like to believe they've escaped history. We talk about progress as if it's linear, permanent, and cumulative. Each generation assumes it has finally solved the problem of instability. Better data, better policy, better institutions. But Ibn Khaldun's core insight cuts right through all of that: optimism. The cycle doesn't disappear when systems become more advanced. It accelerates. Asabiya still exists today, it's just harder to see. Social cohesion now shows up as trust in institutions, confidence in currencies, belief in rules, and willingness to cooperate within large, complex systems. When those elements are strong, economies grow. People invest. Risk feels manageable. Long-term planning makes sense. When they weaken, everything becomes transactional. Short-term thinking dominates. Extraction replaces contribution. You can see this clearly in boom periods. Early in an expansion, growth feels genuinely productive. New businesses form, innovation spreads, returns are tied to real output. Think of the early days of any major technological wave. The energy is real, the creation is real. Over time, success changes the game. Capital concentrates, barriers rise. Financial engineering begins to outperform actual production. Wealth becomes less about creating value and more about positioning within the system. This is the modern version of Ibn Khaldun's elites drifting away from the productive base. Governments face the same exact pressures he described centuries ago. As economies grow, states expand alongside them. Programs multiply, administrative layers thicken. None of this is inherently malicious, it's structural. Prosperity creates demands that only continued prosperity can temporarily sustain. But when growth slows, the commitments remain. Revenue becomes harder to generate. The temptation to extract intensifies. This is where taxation, debt, and monetary policy intersect. Modern states don't rely solely on taxes anymore. They borrow, they inflate, they defer costs into the future. But the logic Ibn Khaldun identified still applies, just with a delay built in. Debt, in this sense, functions like delayed taxation. It allows states to preserve living standards and institutional scale without immediately confronting declining productivity. For a while, it works. Confidence holds, markets absorb the issuance, growth appears stable. But the underlying dynamic hasn't changed. The system is still consuming future output to support present structures. Eventually, the arithmetic becomes unavoidable. Ibn Khaldun would recognize this moment instantly. It's the phase where complexity outpaces coordination, where maintaining appearances becomes more important than maintaining foundations, where leaders mistake temporary stability for permanent strength. This isn't collapse. This is pre-collapse, the stage where systems feel the most confident and the most vulnerable at the exact same time. So what makes this cycle so persistent? It doesn't rely on bad intentions. It relies on normal behavior under success. Individuals respond to incentives. Institutions protect themselves. Elites rationalize extraction. Each step feels completely justified in isolation. It's only when you zoom out and look at the whole picture that the pattern becomes obvious. Modern financial markets amplify this dynamic. Asset prices rise faster than wages. Speculation outpaces production. Financial assets detach from underlying value. This creates the illusion of wealth without the cohesion to sustain it. When corrections come, they don't just reset prices. They test belief. Who trusts the system? Who expects protection? Who bears the cost? Ibn Khaldun understood that legitimacy matters more than force. States can compel compliance for a time, but they cannot compel productivity indefinitely. When people no longer believe the system works for them, participation declines, innovation slows, risk-taking collapses. The economy contracts, not because resources disappear, but because cooperation does. This is why economic cycles feel so brutal. They aren't just financial adjustments. They are social realignments. Power shifts. Old structures weaken. New groups emerge with stronger cohesion and discipline. The cycle resets, not because history wants balance, but because incentives demand it. And importantly, Ibn Khaldun never promised an escape. He didn't believe wisdom could freeze systems at their peak. His insight was more unsettling than that. Decline is not a failure of intelligence. It's a consequence of success. The same forces that build wealth eventually undermine the very conditions that made it possible. So what does that mean for you as an individual? Ibn Khaldun wasn't writing personal finance advice, but his framework offers something just as valuable: perspective. Understanding cycles doesn't make you immune to them, but it does change how you interpret what's happening around you. You stop mistaking peaks for permanence. You stop confusing scale with stability. You start recognizing when incentives are shifting, even before prices catch up. This is where real financial clarity quietly begins. Not with perfect timing, not with perfect prediction, but with humility, with the understanding that systems are temporary, confidence is fragile, and cohesion is more valuable than any asset class. You don't need to outrun the cycle. You just need to stop being surprised by it. Ibn Khaldun's genius wasn't that he predicted the future, it was that he stripped the future of its mystery. By anchoring economics in human behavior, he made cycles visible. And once something is visible, it loses its power to shock. History doesn't repeat because people are foolish. It repeats because incentives remain stubbornly consistent. Ibn Khaldun saw that clearly, long before modern economics gave the cycle its names, its charts, and its equations. His work reminds us that beneath every market, every state, and every financial system lies the same fragile foundation: trust. When trust holds, prosperity follows. When it fractures, decline begins, quietly, slowly, long before the headlines ever catch up. The real question isn't whether the cycle is happening, it's where in the cycle you're standing right now, and whether you're paying close enough attention to notice.